morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back. I've just had the privilege over many years of being Victor Fung's sidekick in this enterprise, and it's been enormously rewarding to watch it grow and thrive and expand in scope and influence, so I'm really pleased. So what I'd like to try to do this morning, and look, we're in an uncharted territory, so I'm going to say some things that probably are wrong. But I say them with some humility and in the spirit of provoking some discussion. My major thesis is that we're in the early stages of a very major transition in the global economy, and not just a storm that will pass. And I think the great challenge is to start the process, as the chief executive just said, of creating a workable and reasonably open global economy with a multilateral structure and at least some rules that's adaptive to these changes that we're experiencing. Now, some people think, let me just say a word about economics. I don't know if Larry Lau will agree with this, but we don't have very good models of transitions. I think it's fair to say. We have models of equilibrium, and when we have a transition, we say we're going from one equilibrium to another, and that's nice, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about the path that you're on. So we're operating without the normal conceptual apparatus that we sometimes count on in dealing with policy issues. One view of where we are, and this is a bit of a straw man, if you'll forgive me, is that we have a temporary period of difficulty, trade war that will get settled and subside at some point, that President Trump and his idiosyncratic characteristics will not be a permanent feature of the landscape, that trust in government will be restored, that Europe will get itself sorted out and become a major player in the global economy, that the emerging economies will restabilize after getting out of balance in a low interest rate environment in the post-crisis period, and that huge increment in gross debt that we've added to the global economy, roughly an increment equal to the global GDP, will somehow not cause a systemic crisis, and instead will diminish, much as happens after a war, by relatively high and sustained real and nominal growth. And after all of that, we'll go back to some variant of the system that we've enjoyed in the post-war period, and we'll be okay. Now, nobody can say that's impossible, but I find it extremely unlikely. And so what I'd like to do is use my time this morning to suggest why I think it's unlikely. And I do these in no particular order. First, I think it's pretty clear that the emerging economies have become big and powerful with China in the lead, and they expect, rightly, to have a role in architecting the global economy in the next go-around, and they should. And there's greater diversity. That diversity has caused problems in the WTO in reaching agreements on trade. There's issues of flexibility and so on that need to be dealt with. Second, I think that for the foreseeable future, there will be a rivalry, multidimensional rivalry, economic, technological, strategic, between the United States and China, just being realistic. Now, that doesn't mean that, you get bad outcomes. I mean, I think what's undetermined now is what combination of cooperation and competition characterizes that rivalry as we go forward. And I think there's a range of scenarios, some of them really quite good, that can emerge from that. The third thing that's really very striking, it's been mentioned earlier this morning, is this rising tide of nationalism. There is a pretty clear pulling back on the part of citizens of countries, regardless of the governance structure, from some full-blown, high-speed trend toward globalization, with global governance institutions and so on. Thank you. I don't think anybody understands, at least I haven't read anything that is what I call a comprehensive explanation of this nationalism, but there's a lot of interesting things being said, and it appears to be the result of a combination of factors. I'll just very briefly. One is adverse distributional aspects of growth patterns in developed countries is pretty clearly adding fuel to the flames. Second, there's a kind of rejection of established parties and elites that populate them, and that's a kind of rejection of the system and the people who supported it before. There's a loss of trust that isn't easily rebuilt overnight. Immigration, I interpret, it's a major, major issue. Immigration, I interpret as a question having to do with identity in societies and so on. And finally, you have national security issues. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So those forces, I think, are creating more than a fairly significant headwind with respect to getting on with the agenda that I think everybody in this room wants to see pursued, which is a form of multilateralism that is inclusive, that doesn't knock out the smaller, poorer countries of the world and somehow close down the access. My version of that is bilateralism's fine, for the major players like China, like the United States, and some of the major emerging economies. But it's not fine for Zambia, right? Nobody's going to devote a whole lot of resources. So that's why this multilateral structure that got created in the post-war period, even if it was created mainly for war recovery, is so important to recover in some form or other. The fourth factor I wanted to mention that I think we have to acknowledge and deal with is what I call a clash of systems. We do not have the same structures across economies in the world. In the West, we tend to have relatively small governments and relatively bright lines separating the private and public sector. That's not necessarily the right answer, but there are other systems in which the government has, a different set of roles, where the boundary lines between the public and private sector are vaguer, I guess, where there's more crossover activity. I don't mean to be vague about this. State-owned enterprises having important roles, not only domestically, but when the country goes abroad to do foreign direct investment and so on. And I can remember thinking 10 years ago when I was in China, interacting with the policymakers, saying something like, you're not all that interested in outbound foreign direct investment right now, but when it happens, we're going to encounter this clash, of systems, because the rules that were put in place in the post-war period were rules that were designed to work, for the Western version of how to organize the system. Now, the reason this hasn't been confronted is there was a theory. It's an arrogant theory, but I'm going to state it anyway, and it comes from the West. And the theory was, whatever the form of organization in the development process, when you get to advanced country status as measured by income, everybody's going to be like us, right? And I don't know anybody who believes that anymore, and I certainly don't, which means that in that and multiple other dimensions, we're going to have to deal with heterogeneity in terms of structure and governance, and I view that as part of the challenge. It's not an easy challenge. I don't think it's impossible to deal with, but simply ignoring it is not going to work, in my view. The last thing that I want to talk about, and it's a huge subject, don't get depressed, I'm not going to cover it all, is the digital technologies. Right? Now, there's a host of issues that have risen to the surface in the last five years or so. If you asked people 15 years ago, anybody, including me, what's the internet? The answer would have been, well, it's this big open system, and data flows through it and people communicate, and it's global in scope because it has standardized protocols, and there's a few people none of us have ever met who have decided what those protocols are, and it's great. And that was just naive. There's a whole bunch of downsides that we didn't anticipate associated with the internet. A short list is, I'm using the internet now as a little bit of a proxy for digital technologies, but the jobs and automation discussion is clearly on the list. So is privacy, so is data security, So is the impact on political and social processes, not to mention foreign influences to the extent those borders are open. And it goes on. Early childhood development, the impact on cognitive processes. I mean, I often wonder when I'm walking down the streets of Milan, bumping into people staring at a screen, what the, what the long-run impact of this is on their brains. Monopoly power and its occasional abuse, especially associated with the mega platforms. And by the way, the mega platforms right now are all located in 2 countries, China and the United States. In Europe, we have no mega platform. This is rather important because it's the epicenter of the development of the application of artificial intelligence in its modern form. And so on. But I think the most important, these things are all being addressed. And I guess I want to say 2 things about this. One, they're going to be addressed at the national level because they're the only places that have the legitimacy and authority. And nations are not going to do the same thing. And that means that we're going to have a more heavily regulated internet, and the regulations are not going to harmonize, at least not without a great effort, and I don't think they will, in fact. If I had to give an example, I would say there's an issue about objectionable content on the internet. I don't think China and the United States, because of the way they're put together, are going to take the same approach to that. And I'm not judging which one's better. But in China, the government has the right to access the data when it's of national importance, and they have the right to screen content when it threatens public welfare, social stability, and so on. In the United States, by Constitution, there isn't any entity that has that right. It's very hard to see how the regulatory regimes are going to turn out to be the same. So I have taken to describing this as the sort of partial balkanization of the internet. Now, Victor and I were in Istanbul, and I said this, and a very nice lady stood up and said, "We're in the Balkans." And you might want to choose a different word for this. So let's call it partial fragmentation, I guess. She's right. But the second point, and I'll try to be brief about this, is I think even more important than all of these other issues. And that is that the national security side of our societies has decided that the digital technologies are critical elements of military and defense capability, national security. And I know some of you may think this is cybersecurity, but it goes well beyond that. This is artificial intelligence, it's image recognition, which is an essential component of autonomous vehicles, whether they fly or go under the water or drive across the land or walk, right? Now, they may be exaggerating this, but the simple point I want to make is that what used to be a relatively pure economic agenda isn't anymore. Because the epicenter of the development of many of these technologies isn't in a separate part of the economy. It's in the mega platforms like Alibaba, like Baidu, like Amazon, and so on. And why? I mean, I think everybody in the room knows why, but I'll say it anyway. Because they have the data, massive amounts of data, which is required for the application of AI in its current form. They have the computing power in their extraordinary cloud computing systems, and they have these very high-speed networks. This theory has been around for at least 25 years. You know, academics developed it, neural networks, deep learning algorithms, and so on. You just couldn't apply it until now. So there we are. We have, we have the military, the national security side, interjecting, and this is a different set of considerations. I'm not saying that that this is a zero-sum game or that the incentives are all completely misaligned relative to the economic agenda, but they're not perfectly aligned for sure. And this is starting to affect things. It's going to affect cross-border investment in technology. I hope it does not. Addressing the Vice Chancellor's comments, address cross-border movement of ideas and people who carry them in their heads, but it's a possibility. And so realistically, we're going to have to live with this and build the new multilateralism around it. Last comment, if I haven't talked too long, is these digital technologies are just going to bring enormous changes, both positive and negative. On the positive side, or the challenging side, I guess, global supply chains are going to be completely reconfigured. You know, both the domestic and the cross-border parts of it. That's a huge subject by itself. There's an issue that I hope Victor and others talk about later on because they have such great experience having to do with the development model. For non-resource-rich countries, the successful development model is what's come to be called the Asia development model, which is comparative advantage based on well-educated labor. And there is at least a chance that we're on an unknown but not terribly long time horizon that the digital technologies, automation specifically, will sort of cut off that technology, if you want to think of it. By cut off, I mean displace, right? On cost-quality considerations, just be superior. In which case, there's an issue that I think is terribly important for the late starters, the early-stage developing countries, of what is the growth model. I mean, it's very hard to imagine high-speed, sustained growth without accessing the global economy's demand in some form or other. So you've got to figure out this question of what is the comparative advantage is of central importance, and I think we might have an interesting discussion of that. And the last thing is that I think there is an underappreciated huge opportunity in what the Chinese friends around the mega platforms, specifically Alibaba and Ant Financial, have come to call these digitally enabled ecosystems with the platform as the architect at the center. When you think about it, and mobile payments and all the financial services that are derivative to that, when you think of that, the inclusive dimensions of that, let me back up. We all know what ecosystems are. We all lived in one. I lived in Silicon Valley. You know, they're complementary resources, you know, that make, you know, innovation and exchanging ideas kind of easy and so on. These aren't different. They're just digitally enabled, so they're kind of turbocharged. And I think they just have enormous potential in a wide range of developing countries. And I'm incredibly encouraged to see that the major players in this dimension, particularly the Chinese players, are aggressively investing across borders, initially here in Asia, but I mean, you're starting to see them in Europe now, following the 200 million Chinese tourists. I mean, I can't prove to you this morning that's going to be a perfect substitute for the old growth model in the early stage developing countries, but it sure looks promising. So it's not all gloom and doom. But I think we have a challenging period ahead of us, and, you know, frankly, I've been looking forward to this day for a long, long time, because I think we're going to try to make some progress on some of these things. Thank you very much for listening.